Good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rochelle Hood, and I have the pleasure of serving as SSON's Global Head of Customer Analytics and Research. And today I'm going to be kicking off with a couple of quick logistics to make sure that you can get the most out of this session. And I'm going to turn over to our chairman to kick off this particular session. So quick logistics. You'll see in your panel the Q&A box. Anytime throughout the entire presentation, please enter your question. We'll be stacking those all up, and then we'll be addressing them at the end of the presentation to our two presenters. If you have any problems, issues, can't hear, if you have a particular question about this webinar or anything in the entire Digital Week conference, please put that in that same box, and our webinar coordinator, Alisa, will respond back to you and assist you with any needs that you may have. Also, be sure to keep an eye on that chat box because we will also be putting some information and updates about your digital gift bag that will include information on the links to the presentations for the entire conference as well as with some additional bonus information. So that's all of the quick logistics I need to go through with you. And now it's my absolute pleasure to welcome back to our digital stage our chairman for this year's SS Week Europe digital event, Phil Searle, CEO and founder of Chazy Partners. Phil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. Hello, everybody. Good day, and welcome to everyone who's just joined for the first time today, and welcome back for those of you that have been on the two sessions we've had this morning. Just as a recap, we had a session this morning by Gary Critchley, the head of UK Shared Services at National Grid, talking about adding value to the C-suite and strategic partnership for the business, and specifically talking about what National Grid have done since they divested a significant part of their business over the last couple of years or so. In the second session, we had a panel discussion led by Rob Cohen, Vice President at Unilever, and attended by Joanne Gavigan, Director of Global Process Ownership at Unisys. And during that session, we talked about the GPO model, which is a big area of discussion around global process ownership, global business services, etc. In this third session, actually, I will be leading it with my colleague, Daniel Lawrence. Daniel Lawrence is also from Chazy Partners, and he and I will be doing a presentation now, going through some of the latest trends on shared services, outsourcing, offshoring, and technology. And then Daniel will then lead a session specifically focusing on RPA, Robotic Process Automation, and some of the latest trends and best practices in that journey. So that's what we're going to be doing today, and Daniel will be joining us after I finish my session. So with that, we'll get stuck straight into the session right now. Okay, so briefly, Chazy Partners. As I'm the CEO of Chazy Partners, and Chazy Partners is a global consulting business, advisory business, focusing on four key areas: shared services, RPA, which we're going to discuss shortly, business transformation in general, and enterprise-wide security. Just for those of you that don't know, we were founded in 2006, which is about 11 and a half years ago now. We're headquartered in California, but we have offices throughout the world, including in the UK. We basically do evaluations, assessments, provide strategic advice, project implementation expertise, and subject matter expertise, either for setting up new shared services and structures or for looking at existing shared services centers and structures, for example, outsourcing models and technology. We focus on the big four of finance, HR, IT, and procurement, but we also cover other back office areas and support areas, including facilities, legal, and the big one, customer operations and other functions. At Chazy, we are practitioners first. For example, myself, I'm a former CFO, business unit CFO, and former corporate controller of a company called Freecom Corporation, that some of you may remember. And in those roles, we've led and implemented global service delivery models, global consulting, global outsourcing structures, etc. And we brought that practical expertise to the roles we perform as consultants. Okay, now on to the actual session today. Here's the agenda. So I'm going to be talking about some of the latest trends and using the Shared Services and Outsourcing Network 2017 report as part of that discussion. Then I'll be giving some of my own and the Chazy Partners viewpoint of some of these latest trends. Then I'll hand over to Daniel, who will discuss the RPA phenomenon and give some example best practices if you are considering progressing on the RPA journey. And then he'll close with a case study on an RPA example of a specific RPA implementation. And then we'll wrap up Q&A at the end of that session. Okay. So, some of the latest trends. There's a fair amount on this slide, but I'm going to just touch on a few of these areas. Now, for those of you that have been around this space for a while, shared services was probably started about mid-1980s. So we've been around for over 30 years now. And so some of the trends and evolutions I'm going to be touching on here. But as you look at this top left-hand box, which is SSO age, which is basically the age of a shared services organization, you can see a fairly even split here from this report 2017. 29% 0 to 3 years, 18% 3 to 5 years, 23% 5 to 10, and 30% over 10 years. So there's a bunch out there that have been around quite a long time. And as I see so often in this space, there are new starters all the time, and there are still many, many organizations that haven't done actually anything at all or very much in shared services. In fact, when I link back to the discussion with Gary this morning, the National Grid Shared Service Center has been around over 10 years, so it's one of the mature shared service centers. However, it still has a hell of a lot to achieve, an opportunity specifically around further advances in technology and automation, further advances in some of its processes and value chain. So the value driven by these shared services has been phenomenal and is huge, but the opportunity remains consistent and significant. And the split is we have a range from new starters right through to mature. So on the second box you see here, you see the stage, which sort of links to what I was saying. You've got new launches, stabilizing, shifting to mature, and trailblazers. Again, look at the fairly even split on that. The top right-hand box is interesting because you have, it's around geographical spread. Nearly half are global shared services organizations. A further 34% are regional, and only 18% are country-based, which makes a lot of sense with the global delivery models and globalization in general and global ERP. Regional shared services is obviously still significant because of the need to support local legal tax and language requirements. But country-specific is not the exception, but the minority. And some of the countries where I've seen this more prominent are, for example, in countries like Brazil, China, sometimes in certain European countries historically like Germany, where you have shared service centers for that country rather than being pan-regional for whatever reason, either historically or due to local legal tax issues or because the main company is based there. But as you can see, it's mainly the minority as per this report, which is what I would expect. In the bottom left charts, you can see the functions, and this isn't supposed to add up to 100% because you have multifunctional shared services. But what you can see is the big four, as we call them, finance and accounting, HR, IT, and procurement. You see them take up nearly 3/4 of this pie chart. And then you have other areas such as sales and marketing, data analytics, but nothing particularly surprising in here, with finance being very significant and HR coming second, and then IT and procurement following up there. The last box on this page shows the number of ERP systems. So in the old days, in inverted commas, it was seen as best practice there was one ERP system. And that's still generally true. However, the reality is that most organizations don't have one ERP system. And this pie chart shows that clearly, with 26% or only a quarter having one ERP, and a further 43% having 2 to 5, and the rest having more than 2 to 5. The key point here is that while one ERP system might be a global best practice and a direction, shared services and outsourcing in general has been moving ahead with these service delivery models for decades on multiple ERP and multiple technology platforms. As we move forward to the next slide, a couple of pictures here of interest. The one on the left-hand side shows really the focus here is the majority of respondents to this survey plan to shift away from the FTE-based model as process automation takes hold, but remain in-house. Now, we're going to be coming back to that, but traditionally speaking, a lot of internal shared services and definitely outsourcing models were FTE-based. In other words, would have these number of FTEs provide these services, which were moved out of the business or moved away from the internal shared service center and offshore to an outsourcer or either in-house. Very much FTE-based. But with new technology and definitely new value-added offerings and shared services moving up the value chain, as we call it, It's moving more to a process-based, value-adding based model and less FTE-based, and that's true in both shared services internally and outsourced models. On the top right-hand side, you can see that there's a mixture of single functional and multifunctional shared services and GBS. Multifunctional is still regarded as best practice, and that's definitely still a trend, but there are many, many examples of single function SSOs, which, for example, would be finance only or HR only or procurement only or whatever, whereas multifunction is where, by its definition, is multifunction. So finance, HR, IT, procurement, facilities might be all under one umbrella. I would add here there are many organizations that actually have what I call multi-single functional, where they basically move ahead with, say, finance shared services and HR shared services, but they're done independently of each other. So there's finance, would basically the governance is independent and within finance, and the governance for HR is within HR. So that's what I call single multifunctional shared services, or I should say multi-single functional shared services. Now, as you can see from this chart and in the bottom chart here, outsourcing has a part to play, but it's not as significant as maybe was once predicted, and I'll come back to that later, but 11% being fully outsourced here. And in the bottom right-hand corner, it's talking about mainly BPO driven being 14%, and hybrid, which is popular and links to the GBS model, the Global Business Services model in the top chart, being about 30% and 56% being in-house captives. What that tells me is that in-house captive is still predominant, but with GBS, there's a hybrid model with elements of outsourcing is definitely popular, but standalone, mainly BPO-driven outsourcing is the exception, despite what may have been predicted 10 years ago. Okay, as we move to the next slide, I'm not going to read this slide, but it's useful for you guys to take away later. But you can see that there's a mixture here of captive shared service and BPO providers, and the SSON have done some analysis of this, and you can see basically the number is very significant across the whole world, across all countries. And this shared services model, combined with BPO, the reason why it's grown and consistent and had to evolve is because it's been successful. And it's been able to break that centralization, decentralization cycle by providing services in an efficient and effective fashion. That's not to say it's always successful. There are obviously many examples of suboptimal or even failed implementations, but generally speaking, this model has been very successful. And as a result of that, it's expanded globally, as you can see from this chart here. Okay, so having taken into account some of the research that I've just talked through, what do I think and what does Chasey think of where we're going in the shared services and outsourcing space? And what are some of the latest trends and phenomena we see? So, as I mentioned, shared services as a delivery model has been around now for over 30 years, but it has had to continually evolve. And business process outsourcing, as I also mentioned, has been around for the last 10 years. In fact, I recall back in 2008 in the US, I actually chaired the very, very first BPO stream at a shared services event. For those of you that have been in this space for a while, if you remember, it used to be called Shared Services Week and not Shared Services and Outsourcing Week. But over time, business process outsourcing became involved, and in fact, 10 years ago, it was being predicted as probably being far more prevalent than it is today. That's not to say that it hasn't added significant value as it has, but it hasn't been the all-encompassing multi-tower shifting of processes to outsource, or it's been more focused than that. When we think about outsourcing, and we also think about offshoring, so a lot of the outsourcing trend has actually been to leverage labor arbitrage benefit from lower cost locations. Now, that can have been done internally by setting up your own shared service center in an offshore location, either through a brownfield or a greenfield location, which we'll come back to. But outsourcers have been able to provide lower cost services and benefit from the labor arbitrage space. And that has been prevalent over the last 10 years. However, there has been a recent slowdown in this, and there's a number of reasons for this, including some of the advances in technology, which we're going to be talking about today, some preference for onshoring and nearshoring for whatever reason, either to have customer call centers, for example, close to the customer, or some of the services close to the business. Some of even the political and economic matters that we've been seeing recently have resulted in some onshoring and nearshoring as well. And then, of course, we've had some flattening of the labor arbitrage opportunity. Now, that's not to say the labor arbitrage opportunity has gone away. It has not. But because there has been significant growth in the offshore locations over the last 10 years, that relative benefit from that labor arbitrage opportunity has flattened. But there are still organizations that leverage that, and rightly so, but it's less of a compelling story, relatively speaking, than it was a few years ago. Linking to that, it's very interesting that many of the BPO, business process outsourcing, and IT outsourcing providers are hiring themselves a lot more staff onshore and paying higher salaries as a direct result of this. In fact, just last week I saw an announcement from Capgemini talking about hiring people within the United States. I've seen announcements similar to that from other outsourcers, including the likes of Infosys and Capgemini and others. And what that's doing is it's bringing some of the service provision for the outsourcers closer to the onshore, closer to the business, which has resulted in them being able to provide more regional-based support, but it has also resulted in an increase in costs of their staff. In fact, I saw an HFS report recently where I saw that some of the salaries of some of the IT staff was going from sort of 60, 70,000 a year to 120,000 plus a year, as employed by some of the IT outsourcers as a result of this. This is just consistent with a trend of bringing provision closer to the customer and some advances in technology, and linking back to the recent flooding and offshoring I mentioned just a moment ago. Technology continues to disrupt this space, and again, we're going to be talking a little bit about this with RPA later, but when you think about how far technology has come in the last 15 years, it's crazy really, with ERP, and then of course with the whole trend towards mobile and software as a service and cloud-based technology. It continues to disrupt the shared services and outsourcing space. However, I would add that it's within that, it's continuing the trend of where we're going. It's not necessarily changing the direction in totality, but it's definitely changing some of the levers that can be pulled by these shared services and BPO organizations. We've all heard about big data and data analytics, and that continues to be a big area of growth. Along with data, it's consistency and measurement and reporting, providing value to the business, so that's another big trend. Moving up the value chain has been something that's been discussed for many, many years, and that basically means moving from the more transactional administrative type services to more professional and technical type services. So, for example, in the finance space, transactional administrative will include things like accounts payable, accounts receivable, general accounting. Moving up the value chain, we'll move more into the financial planning, reporting, financial analysis, FP&A sort of space. In procurement, it will mean moving away from some of the just purchase requisitioning, purchase order processing, and more into the sourcing, support space, and data analytics space. So that move up the value chain has been predicted for many, many years, has happened, continues to happen, but it's probably going to accelerate as well, in my opinion, and our opinion, over the next 5 years or so. Okay, so continuing on this, what are some of the other trends? Well, higher education and public sector growing awareness of shared services is very significant trend of the last 5 years. There wasn't really a great deal of shared services in higher education 5 years ago. And 10 years ago, there wasn't a great deal in the public sector. When you think of federal government, provincial government, local government, in many jurisdictions around the world, specifically in the US and the UK and Canada, but also many other European countries, France, Germany, etc., it's not been a particularly high growth area, but that's changing. Why is it changing? Well, because of all the trends to tighter budgets and the need to, in higher education, for example, you can't continually increase fees for education. There have been reduced grants from local and federal government, and that has caused a squeeze In fact, there is a chart I sometimes show which shows the cost of higher education since 1979 versus the cost of healthcare versus the cost of car. And the cost of a car has gone up like 95%. The cost of higher education has gone up something like 1,260%. Well, that just can't continue. So higher education specifically is looking at shared services as one of the tools available to help it provide back office services and reduce costs providing service, which obviously will help to provide research funds, education funds, and hopefully at some point start to reduce fees required of students. In the public sector, of course, in the government, it's been a big push in the UK, the Gerson Review, and in the US there's been a consistent push for that. We've seen that in Canada. It's starting to become more of a focus in Latin America, across Europe, and of course Australia and Australasia, New Zealand, etc. have seen a big move to public sector shared services. That trend will definitely continue over the next 5 to 10 years. The location trend, brownfield versus greenfield, that's an interesting one. Brownfield basically means it's where it's offshore to a location, but a brownfield means an existing location for the business where it has, for example, existing office space, existing manufacturing, existing people, staffing, HR support, but it's still an offshore location. Greenfield, on the other hand, is where it's a brand new location in a completely new country where there's no existing company infrastructure. The trend has definitely been more brownfield than greenfield, although there are examples of greenfield. For example, Coca-Cola Enterprises or Coca-Cola European Partners set up its brand new shared service center in Sofia, Bulgaria, in a greenfield location where the company hadn't operated beforehand. But many organizations continue to follow a brownfield location, basically due to reducing the cost of investment and reducing risk, but still moving to third-party locations. Historically, from a shared services and outsourcing perspective, it's been more lift and shift versus what you might call improve and move. That isn't to say improve and move hasn't happened. There are many examples of where an organization has actually looked to change and improve processes, automate, standardize, as well as move at the same time. But generally speaking, lift and shift has been the main focus. There are a number of reasons for this, one being the change management involved in improving and moving. Secondly, for example, the example that allows you to move fairly quickly and historically speaking, get more from the labor arbitrage benefit. And thirdly, once you've lifted and shifted, then because things are more centralized, you can then move forward with automating, standardizing more effectively. Again, that isn't to say that improve and move hasn't happened. It absolutely has, but there has historically been more of a trend for lift and shift. It's going to be interesting to see going forward how much technology changes that dynamic as we go forward. Talking of technology, then I look at some, I touched on this earlier, but the cloud-based technology, software as a service, and on-premise data centers has changed a lot of things. The ability to go to a third-party provider and have automated, high-security, cloud-based technology has supported the move to globalization, supported the move to optimization and to automation of processes. And those opportunities weren't there so much 10, 11 years ago. Of course, that has driven some other challenges around security and things like that, but it's a trend that absolutely will continue as we move forward from here. That actually links to social media and the need for mobile solutions, which has been huge, especially, I would say, in the customer space. People demand having access to information and data and facilities through their mobile devices and through social media. And that trend is really over the last 3, 4, 5 years and it is accelerating dramatically. And that won't stop. And for shared service centers and GBS providers and outsourcers, the need to be able to provide access to information, data, and solutions at one's fingertips is definitely going to continue. And that will be a big, big trend going forward. This key next point is a statement I've been making for the last 15 years. It's better to eliminate than relocate. Now, that isn't to say that lift and shift hasn't been the main driver, but in the longer run, if you can automate, standardize, improve a process rather than just relocate it, you obviously derive most significant benefit. If you don't need to run a process, for example, you have duplication or unnecessary steps, then it's better to eliminate that rather than just shift it offshore because it's potentially lower cost. The next bullet is we really need to start looking at end-to-end processes. We talk about end-to-end processes, and linking back to the session earlier on, we talk about global process owners and end-to-end processes, and that's really, really important. But to be honest with you, in many ERP and shared services organizations, it's been more focused on functions, less on end-to-end processes. And within end-to-end processes, things like, for example, in the process procure to pay, there's often been too much of a focus on accounts payable. In order to cash, maybe just on accounts receivable. In hire to retire, maybe just on payroll, etc. So we really need to look at end-to-end processes to drive the most significant benefit. And there's a lot of opportunity there to continue down that track. While saying that, there is a big opportunity, especially with some of the RPA technologies, to automate within processes, and we'll be talking a little bit about that again in a minute. And finally, on the Chasey view, all the trends I've just mentioned too, especially around the process technology and locational changes, means that leaders and teams have to be retrained and realigned as we manage to eliminate more manual processing and we manage to automate and we move further up the value chain and we think more globally and we think cross borders and we even get into more strategic areas. The leaders need to change and understand that, and people within the organizations, the shared services and outsourcing teams, need to move up the value chain themselves, and that requires a change in emphasis, focus and training for those teams. So with that said, hopefully I will take some questions at the end around the latest trends, and hopefully you have a couple you've thought of as we've gone through that. But before we take the questions at the end, I'm going to hand over to Daniel Lawrence, who will talk about RPA and take us through the next few slides. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, all attendees. My name is Daniel Lawrence. I'm the Director for Europe for Chasey. It'll actually be very interesting to hear this presentation again in another 10 years, especially to hear how this new phenomena of RPA and automation has had an impact on shared services and outsourcing with the benefit of hindsight. So let's talk a little bit about RPA. And it's, some of this you may well have heard already, but we've got to start somewhere, and we start at the beginning. And in its very simplest terms, RPA is automation software. But it is definitely a little different from what we've seen before. Working at the user level, it can imitate the human actions and interactions across most systems in an organization, much like a human can. But it is possible to get so much more out of it than that, depending on the approach that is being taken. The concepts underlying RPA aren't necessarily that new, but the latest evolution is pretty exciting, and as Phil said, it's fairly disruptive in its form. And it does present some significant opportunities, especially within shared services and outsourcing. In this presentation, I'm going to share some insights from our own RPA journey as a consulting firm and with our clients. We'll share our thoughts on what RPA is and isn't from our view, look at some of the myths and the benefits that exist around it. But ultimately, though, from what we've seen so far, the technology is the easier part of this. Bots, as we call them, truly can be built in just hours at the simplest level. And in this short presentation, I'm going to share some thoughts on the underlying but very important foundations that you need for a more successful automation journey. Now, these essentially are very much the same elements that you would need for any transformation journey, whether it's RPA or otherwise, but it's good to come back to them in this new form. So let's take a look, first of all, clarifying some of the myths and misunderstandings which have started to develop in recent times regarding RPA. On the left, a sample of some of the most common and incorrect non-facts sort of circulating, and on the right present some counterpoints which we've found from our own experience to be more the case. Looking first of all at the replacement of jobs, there's been a lot of predictions about this in terms of current and over the next number of years, and perhaps in time it could swing more in that direction. But for now, at least, what we're currently seeing, the reality is that this is more about freeing up people's time from the mundane, repetitive work, or to even the redesign of processes, being the catalyst for that, so that they become much more effective and efficient. And then it allows people to work on more rewarding or more positive business-focused activities. In terms of end-to-end, there is a lot of investment return possible everywhere within the processes. Whilst it's ideal to think and plan longer term and end-to-end, as Phil was just mentioning, there is still a great deal of success to be had in these early stages in looking at specific aspects of processes where they're needed most, and potentially where the most manual effort or errors occur. Labor and overheads is one of the main things. It's the same sort of story with shared services, and the story with shared service journey often begins with saving costs and then reducing heads. But there's much more than simply digital arbitrage available here with RPA and automation. The ability to contain costs, for example, whilst undergoing growth or absorbing a greater number of activities, especially important for shared service teams who are under pressure by their internal customer to do more with the same amount of money or the same amount of people. This can include adding new activities or just performing tasks faster or with fewer errors and rework, which then don't impact the customers. And this time that's freed up by operational staff can then be diverted or redeployed to more rewarding activities. And that supports the industry trends for SSCs in terms of moving up the value chain or moving towards a GBS model. The onshoring myth, in reality, it's more of an opportunity to reduce offshore outsourced activities, potentially bring it into captive centers or possibly combining that with a switch to sort of automation teams, in terms of a longer term roadmap, which could potentially be located more near shore. And then this last one around the operational staff, that they just won't support this. They see the Q&A, they see this as a threat. Our experience so far is that the operations staff we work with our clients are very embracing and owning of the automation journey, and they're working very much side by side with the digital workforce that they're helping to create, and which also that links closely to the first point around the replacement of jobs. Okay, so hopefully that's helped to debunk some of the myths that we've been hearing around RPA. Let's look a little deeper though into the RPA technology itself and consider what might be appropriate in given circumstances. Combined with our own automation objectives, there are some key factors to consider which you should look at to initially drive what you want your RPA to do, which solution or combination of solutions to choose that might be suitable. Now you can look from a variety of, say, the simple swivel chair mimicry automation steps to full-blown transformation of more complex end-to-end processes with structured data. Whilst RPA isn't necessarily going to fix everything, your best bet is to match your RPA solution to the specific scenarios and needs that you have, which is something we touch on a little bit later in terms of best practices. But some of the key things to think about and the questions to ask in terms of scale, do you need a limited desktop fix only, or something that is real full enterprise-wide with multiple systems and enabling virtual desktops in order to make this thing work? Sophistication of the processes and how complex they are is another key driver. There's only so much RPA can actually do given in its current format. Sophistication does vary though between vendor solutions and also between the different solutions which any particular vendor can offer, whether it's their sort of entry-level free software versus their fully licensed products. There's a great deal of difference that you can find in the sophistication of the product that they can actually deliver. Looking at whether you need something that is more tactical or strategic, so very short to longer term. Do you need a simple record and replay sort of solution, or a much more comprehensive digital transformation program in place? You will also find a great deal of resilience variability in the different projects. And this one really comes back to how structured the data is that the RPA tool needs to work with. So again, these are all going to drive what solution you think is right for you. And the last one, security and compliance, depends on how important this is to your needs. A lot of organizations are regulated and have very specific industry standards for security and compliance needs to meet. And the different tools that are available will have different ways of matching those or not. So you'll have to incorporate that into your decision matrix. So there are some of the general considerations to think about when you're planning your RPA journeys. But let's look at some of the benefits in general to those who are adopting RPA, but also the benefits of RPA over other traditional IT solutions. And the benefits can vary greatly. These are some of the most common health factors that we're finding. Ultimately, all are possible, It depends on what you want to get out of it, of course, in terms of your goals and objectives, what you want to achieve. So it is very clear automation goals are important and be realistic about what you want to achieve. However, there are many benefits of choosing RPA versus trying to look at other traditional IT implementations. I think the key thing to remember about this is that Phil touched on it there, a lot of companies have many ERP systems in place. It's the data that's the asset, and that's the key thing to remember. So whatever you can use to manipulate and get access to that data in the best, cheapest way is the way to look forward. So RPA is definitely easier, but not necessarily easy. And this is my key watch out in terms of as you start to think about this. There are success and failure stories when clients have been looking at proof of concepts and pilots for these RPA solutions. The ease and the use of implementation are very high, and they're very clear benefits. The systems are typically very user-based. They leave the underlying systems generally untouched. The only real requirement is to get system access control overcome, and that's really something you do straight up front. The investment cost is generally much lower. Most of what you'll see in terms of the vendors that they are FTE pricing based. Flexibility is a major key benefit. It's really important to get the most out of your bots. So this is really about sweating your assets effectively. Once you've got these things in place, you need to make sure that those bots are earning the keep, that they're switched between tasks and switched according to priorities, either in the shared service center or to the business, and make sure that you're making full use of those robots around the clock, which links us to the availability. And there's a bit of a caveat here. Yes, bots can be available 24/7, but both the RPA systems and the systems that they interact with, the ERP systems, will need some downtime for maintenance, upgrades, patches, etc., to be applied. So it's not necessarily 24/7. It's close enough, but you need to bear that in mind, that it's not going to be up all the time. And if a system's down, the bot isn't necessarily going to be able to continue the work until it's back up and running again. And then the last point on there, quality, accuracy, and consistency is another major benefit with the bots. They will work in terms of once you program them in the same way every time, same time every day. So that's a key benefit. To demonstrate from our own experience what could possibly be achieved with RPA, I'm going to introduce you to a very, very simple scenario demonstration that we did ourselves internally when we first embarked on our own RPA journey. We decided to build a really simple bot to perform a very simple task, and that task was to search and review email inboxes for emails receiving invoices, to review those, to send a response to the sender if it wasn't attached, to open and validate the invoice if it was, and then transfer those details into what we had as a dummy ERP, in our case an Excel sheet. And we set this up for ourselves as a very simple, mundane, routine tasks that were done day in, day out, every week of the year, and took up a lot of time. So it was for us a very simple one to work on. We timed the average human manual effort that was required to complete this task each time, and on average, and then we did the same thing for the bot. The bot itself, incidentally, only took about 3-4 hours to build fully and test. And we used as our first step, we used some low to no cost off-the-shelf RPA software that was available at the time. And what we found in practice was that for a single invoice, the difference was about 60 seconds, which in itself isn't a great deal. But if you extrapolate that over a number of invoices, and in this case I've used 500 as a number, the difference becomes quite significant and gives us over an 8 hours productivity gain. So it is only a very, very simple, basic example. It ignores system availability and other day-to-day factors that might impact that, but it does highlight pretty clear potential opportunities from applying RPA in some digital transformation, even if it's the most basic level. In a short while, we're going to look at an actual real customer case study with you, but to build on this, so that's the technology itself, and then there are lots of presentations about the technology that have gone. So I'm going to focus more on the important fundamentals of a successful digital transformation in itself. Starting with what we'd recommend as a suitable framework, something like this that's presented on the slide. It's important to think of RPA as a bit more of a journey rather than a single project. And to begin by getting the foundations right from the very start. And that effectively means your operating model, governance framework, your stakeholder engagement, and your change management and comms, which again is very similar to any sort of business transformation project or a journey you might begin. In comparison, remember, the technology is the easier part. These are always the difficult aspects. So moving from left to right, process suitability, don't agonize too long over the discovery process. Apply some very simple rules. We recommend making a notes of the activities and processes which are repetitive, manual, routine, are bound and driven by rules, have structured data, and work across disparate systems. And that's really a good place to start to begin your journey and to actually test out some of this software. In terms of a proof of concept or a pilot, you need to really consider whether and how effective a proof of concept can be. In experience, we found that most test or development systems typically aren't on a par with those in production, if indeed all of the systems that you need access to are available in a test or development system. But if not to worry. RPA in itself isn't an invasive software. There's no integration necessary really. So we have been talking with clients and they've gone straight into doing a first pilot instead, and that's tended to work very well for them. Again, start by following those simple rules of repetitive, manual, routine, rule-bound, and you tend to get a result fairly quickly. It's important to consider what the return on investment is going to be. You're looking at terms of the existing time and cost for an activity or task, what the desired outcomes and expected returns need to be from the automation, so have some clear goals in mind. In terms of an operating model, there's two real main options available once you've got the RPA in which you've started your full automation journey. One is sort of the center of excellence or expertise route, and the second would be more federated. I guess in terms of there's a third option really, which would be a hybrid of those two. Either ultimately is fine, but the key is to make sure that it's being driven by ops and not really IT. That's really the key with this thing to make it work, because it's the subject matter experts who do the day-to-day work who are going to be the most effective people to help design those bots. In terms of vendors, there's quite an exciting choice of options. You need to consider the key factors we looked at earlier in this presentation and weight them according to your own needs to decide which vendor or number of vendors you want to choose to work with. And then ultimately begin devising your digital roadmap. You need to make sure that that's flexible and delivered in an agile way. It's okay to work in 2 to 3 month increments and then review and adjust, but have an end game in mind as to where you want to get to. The golden rule with this is start small, improve it, and then scale quickly. So let's next move it on to some best practices that will help with this. So from our own experience and those also lessons learnt that are being shared by the developing RPA industry overall, it's better to think of in terms of an overall digital transformation rather than just increments of automated mimicry. Now that can have its place and does and can be useful, but it's also important to consider what within the end-to-end processes could also be eliminated, simplified or standardized, back to the point that Phil was making on his slide. Rather than simply automate, this should also be combined with some traditional business transformation disciplines. Use RPA as a lever or a catalyst for better design. So always look back to the simple disciplines of what do we need to eliminate, simplify, as well as automate. Next is to be clear on what you want to achieve and be realistic about it. It's okay to make a quick start and explore the potential for automation, but agree further down the road why, what, when for your transformation journeys in terms of what you want to achieve. Don't underestimate the power and the need for effective change in communication either. Engage very early with the key stakeholders and set expectations. especially with IT, and address their concerns very early on. You're going to need them to make your governance framework work. And you're going to get tripped up on things like system access controls if you don't talk to them fairly early on. And then the last one here, foundations in place for the operating model. This is really about who's going to build and manage a new digital workforce, where and how. And we've touched on a lot of those points already. The governance framework is going to be important from an IT perspective. One of the lessons we learned very early on in our first steps was making sure that we had system access protocols nailed down. And if you don't, the simple things will trip you up later on. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to just talk you through briefly a case study. I know we're getting very close to our time, and I think there's quite a bit of some Q&A coming in. So I just want to wrap up with this one case study from one of our clients, and then we'll go into some Q&A. So we worked with an Asian headquartered company, and they asked us to come in to do a proof of concept and to help them build and create their automation roadmap. And one specific requirement about this vendor had was to actually compare two side-by-side solutions, RPA solutions, which is a unique and different, something we hadn't done before. So we went through the scope of the requirements with the client and built out two identical bots to all intents and purposes in each of the tools, and we tested and deployed those in production. And then once we were able to get them up and running and put transactions through them, we were able to then compare the performance of the two tools, and this was then help the client to then decide which tool that they thought was going to be more appropriate for them. And we also incorporated into that things like how the ease of use and ease of implementation and any other issues that we encountered along the way. So the process that we selected with the client had some very high transaction volumes, but they were all rule-based, and it was all very repetitive and mundane tasks that we looked at. The result of the test and the proof of concept was that both bots did deliver fairly significant productivity gains over the human effort and activity that was required, but there was quite a significant difference between the two. But ultimately, if you go to the bottom of the slide here, you can see that the time gained potentially was an 85 to 90% processing time saved over the human effort. It did reduce errors. That's also included and reflected in that 85 to 90% saving. And it obviously improved the customer service level because it had no missed claims and reduced delays. So it was able to people to then spend time more on interaction with customers as opposed to chasing up and chasing through the level of volumes that were backing up. And that proof of concept was completed and delivered within the 3 weeks that we agreed with the client. So very simple, another very, very simple example of where something can be employed and the potential that can be gained from it. And with that, I'm going to hand back over to Phil. I think, Phil, you've got some Q&A you probably need to get into before you can wrap up the session in a few moments.
Yes, thanks very much, Daniel. Hopefully you guys can still hear me okay on the line. But yes, we do have some questions coming through, and so I'm going to start taking some of those, and Daniel, 1 or 2 will be for you, and I'll take the others. So the first question I've got here is, what would be, in our opinion, the main challenges in adopting shared services in the public sector, potentially compared with the private sector? So it obviously links back to the trends discussion. So that's a very good question. I get asked that a lot, specifically by public sector people. The main answer is yes, it is different in the public sector in terms of some of the challenges, but then again, it's the same. It's more about it being a different emphasis on some of the same challenges. So, but within the public sector, what you have got is you've got very ingrained structures and legacy organizations that have been around often for a lot longer. Things tend to move much more quickly in the private sector, so the change management in the broad terms of operating the public sector are more significant. In addition, there's often very disparate technology, and some of the technology approaches to the public sector mean it's going to be more challenging. In fact, one of the data points I've used is that the spend on technology in the public sector, in higher education and federal government, specifically in higher education, is more than adequate. It's just the use of that spend is very disparate. And so it's really about trying to break down some of these silos across technology and people that is a challenge in the public sector. So that links to one of the main requirements for a success in the private sector, which is senior level support. In the public sector, you're going to have many different organizations you have to talk to. For example, in higher education, you often have to talk to, faculty, you have to talk to advisory councils, you have to talk to HR bodies, you have to talk to public bodies, private bodies, student groups, etc. In the higher education, in the federal government, you've got many bodies as well. So you've got a lot of different organizations you need to engage with in the public sector. In fact, we often talk about the 4 C's of change management, and we've added a fourth more recently. So 4 C's are communication, consultation, and collaboration, which are very consistent with the private sector, all very important and they're relevant components. And then in the public sector, we've seen more permanent consensus where people have more of a veto to making changes. So hopefully that answers the question, but I would say that it doesn't stop you moving forward in the public sector, definitely not. The opportunity and some of the challenges are the same as in the private sector, but you need to be cognizant of some of the history, legacy structures, organizational structures, ways to communicate, change management, etc., and take those into account. The one other thing, of course, I would say is the unionized environment. To the extent you're unionized in the public sector may be different. That's something that needs to be taken into account. So that was hopefully answered that question. And then I'm going to turn now to an RPA question. Daniel, maybe you can take this one. So the question here specifically is, who owns RPA in a shared services environment? Is it shared services? Is it IT? Is it the business? Who is it? And do you have any recommendations on the best place to locate an RPA center of expertise? Daniel, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, thanks, Phil. Most definitely. Ultimately, it does depend on your individual organization. If you ask an RPA vendor, if you ask a consulting firm or an integrator or anyone like ourselves, they're most likely to tell you the best places to locate it anywhere but IT, to be frank. Operations and within shared services is a great place to do it because of the deeper understanding of the breadth and depth of the end-to-end process in theory. But also, if you just want to get some gains out of some of the lower level mundane repetitive tasks, it's all going to be sitting mostly within the shared services organization. So that would be a good place to set up either, if you have a central shared service center or a regional one, to set up a team, an automation team or group within there that could drive the creation, the maintenance of the digital workforce, so they could build your bots for you that could then ultimately be redeployed and changed and switched accordingly to either the shared services or the customer's need. And that would be an ideal way to do it. You do need the IT organization to be on board as a sponsor, though, and they do ultimately own the access controls to the systems. So you need them involved and engaged. They're a key stakeholder, and once you get them through any concerns they have, and you've got them to bless your access controls for the system, your shared services automation team should be able to get moving pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Daniel. Of course, when you talk about the IT organization, you also got to think about enterprise-wide security and enterprise-wide consistency with infrastructure requirements. So I would just add those two in as well. So of course, RPA sits alongside and on top of those things. Clearly, this is all about a partnership approach. I would just add that. Next question I have here is, with the elevating of the value proposition for shared services, do we see a trend whereby we require higher job level workforce in the shared services function? Does that mean that shared services workforce becomes more expensive? The answer to that is yes. As a trend, I would say generally I would agree with that statement, because as you move up the value chain and you automate and standardize and eliminate more of the transaction administrative processes and you move up the value chain, you're going to have to move into a more professional and technical environment. In fact, I mentioned earlier on about some of the hiring and some of the pushing up in costs that's going on in the BPO space and the ITO space as a direct result of that. That is also happening in the shared services space. Now, that's not to say this is going to be as dramatic as the example I gave earlier in the IT space, but it's definitely a trend, and it's a good trend. Because effectively, as we move people and processes that are more transactional, more process-based, and we move them to be more efficiently optimized through technology and standardization and robotics, then it actually enables people to be retrained and refocused and move up the value chain themselves. And I touched on that a little bit earlier today as well, on terms of we're having to retrain our leadership as well as our staff, and that will involve them learning new skills, which is good for them, but it also will make them more marketable and probably will drive up the average cost per head cost, which is linking to the question. But clearly, in terms of the number of heads required to support those activities, that would be reduced. Hopefully that answers that question. Next question I've got here, I know we're starting to run down on time a little bit, but it's a sort of a linked trend and RPA question, and the question is, would, in your opinion, RPA potentially diminish the outsourcing offshoring expansion in the next couple of years? I think the simple answer to that is yes. The extent to which it happens within the next couple of years, I'm not so sure. I don't think it's necessarily going to have a dramatic impact in the next couple of years, but over time, it definitely will, because linking to the discussion about businesses and outsourcers wanting to bring stuff more onshore and closer to the business through and have the opportunity to use RPA to automate through robotics processes and eliminate activity and standardize and achieve some of the benefits Daniel was talking about, then there will be less of a need to move offshore where the labor arbitrage benefit has historically been the case. So I do believe that will be a trend, yes. So to answer the question, I do believe that's the case. Another question here. How would you recommend working with a BPO vendor to inspire RPA implementation? Are there contractual issues to consider? Definitely. And linking back to the conversation this morning with Gary at National Grid, we were talking about this. How do you commercialize with an outsourced RPA when you own the processes, the technology, and potentially the benefits from that? And I was discussing this actually since that call with Daniel. We were chatting about this. RPA for the BPO providers will be important within their service provision. However, will there be close partnerships between the captive, the buyer, and the outsourcer to RPA processes that have already moved to a shared services organization? That's an interesting question. And one of the things I've mentioned is that the innovative outsourcing promised like 5 years ago didn't really happen. It was more labor arbitrage, lift and shift, and some element of standardization, which is partly linked to the contracts, which limited room for maneuver for the outsourcers, to be honest with you. So the way contractual relationships have to work together is going to be key, because if the contract is only FTE based and the contract is specifically based on cost reduction, then I don't see how that's going to work so well. And RPA might have to be there for more onshore captive, although, as I said, RPA itself will be important to the outsourcers themselves as they work on their own processes. So with that, there are some more questions coming in, but I think we've run out of time. We will, however, take any other questions and try and get back to those who've answered them. But hopefully this has been a useful session where we've covered some of the latest trends in shared services, outsourcing, offshoring technology. Daniel's run through some best practices and some of our recommendations on how to look at RPA, what it is, and how to think about implementing in a case study. And so hopefully that's all been useful for you. Our next session is actually going to be in, I believe, in 30 minutes, but I will hand back to Rochelle in a second. That next session is going to be a session run by Tobias from Siemens, linking again to our conversation about this one's how you can make the most of digital transformation, which links to some of the conversation we've had today. So with that, thank you very much for your attendance, and I will hand it back to Rochelle to close out this particular session.
Okay, thanks so much, Phil, and a special thank you to Daniel as well. Very interesting trends which have been tying together some of the themes and topics we've heard across the start of day one here at SS Week Digital Europe. And as Phil mentioned, our next session will be in just 30 minutes, so please dial back in for the session from Tobias at Siemens to hear more about this digital transformation. With that, we thank you for those who have joined us live, and also a special thank you to those of you who are listening to the recording session. And that concludes this webinar.